after he finished, because my God, how do you follow that energy? I mean, that was a proper rant. You should have my job. And you've got the accent even. It's IRA Rush Limbaugh over here. So I'm a left-wing talk radio host, and that in and of itself is a paradox. I mean, so much so that I've never actually told this story before because I'm not comfortable talking about this over the air, but me personally, I'm in recovery. I'm a sober person, and I went to treatment like for chemical dependency. And so during treatment, we had a group where we went around the room, 16 guys, and the question was, if you could do anything in life, what job would you do? And so they go around the room, and most of them answer something like a rapper or like a millionaire or something like that. And the counselor encouraged, said, yeah, you can do that. Like, sobriety comes first, and you can accomplish that. So my answer was left-wing talk radio host. And my counselor, I kid you not, said, well, that's impossible. I'm not kidding. He just said, that is impossible. And so, showed her. So yes, I'm a host on AM950 radio. I host Minnesota Progressive Repartee Thursdays at 4 o'clock, and our new show, Mission Accomplishers, starts at 7 p.m. So I wanted to talk about left-wing media, and I'm going to focus specifically at first on radio, because the fact that my counselor even had that notion that it was impossible for left-wing radio to exist or succeed, that's not the case anymore. So where that stems from, though, is in the 90s, there was the Telecommunications Act, which allowed Clear Channel and Disney to buy up all of the radio stations. So I was young at the time, but I still remember a time when the radio was interesting. Like, you could tune in, and you had unique options, you didn't hear the same music, and you had interesting people talking. But after that Telecommunications Act, Clear Channel bought up everything, and now it's changed radio from a regional thing where you could travel across the country and tune in a station, and it would reflect the character of that area, where now you get the same playlist no matter where you are in the country. And so at that same time, too, we had the rise of Rush Limbaugh. And part of it is to do that with Rush Limbaugh's views are convenient to a Clear Channel, but Rush Limbaugh also is a talented broadcaster. I'm not going to take that away from him. He did gain popularity, but the radio industry thought that's the only thing that could work. So much so that you see it influenced in sports talk or shock jocks. They have to share that conservative opinion. So how our station came about, AM950, was in 2003. There was a movement, and it was the idea of starting Air America, which was a network of, it was left-wing talk radio to combat what was going on right-wing talk radio. And Air America, it did succeed to a certain degree. There was times where Al Franken was the flagship host on Air America. And there was many times that Al Franken beat Rush Limbaugh for the #1 radio show in the country during that time. But Air America had problems that their business model that they chose to use was networks across the country. So radio stations had to sign up for the entire Air America package and play their programming of every single show. And that ended up being a mistake because the company ended up going bankrupt. And when that happened, most of the hosts and the stations that carried Air America, they changed format. Now, at that same time, there was another company, and it was called Democracy Radio, and they syndicated shows rather than that network model, so you could pick up individual shows. And they had Thom Hartmann as a program, Ed Schultz, who passed away but was a phenomenal left-wing talk radio hosts, and Stephanie Miller. So some of these networks picked up some of those shows. So it stuck around. It wasn't completely extinct. Let's talk about Thom Hartmann for a moment, because we're all here for Bernie Sanders and the future of democratic socialism. So Thom Hartmann is the old gun in this industry. He actually wrote a paper that inspired Air America in the first place, and he's been doing his show for over a decade. And very important progressive talker. In fact, he used to have on Bernie Sanders every Friday when Bernie was just an obscure congressperson. And that's really one of the main reasons that drove Bernie Sanders into the national spotlight, from not just being an obscure socialist congressperson, but to having a nationwide audience. And so Thom Hartmann has kept at this. But since Trump, we've seen a rise in the popularity of the format of left-wing talk radio, so much so that the problem is there isn't enough content for stations to cater the format. So Thom Hartmann is currently the 7th highest rated radio program in the entire country as a progressive talk radio host. But and why that's remarkable is because when you consider the Rush Limbaughs, the Hugh Hewitts, who else? Dennis Prager, they're in this infrastructure where in certain markets there's 4 different radio stations carrying them, whereas there isn't the infrastructure because still Clear Channel, or iHeartRadio, if you want to call it that. I won't call it that. I call it Clear Channel. But they still own the entire marketplace virtually. So Thom Hartmann, to get to that point, has picked up on community radio and being played across the country. So shows like his, Democracy Now!, Stephanie Miller, have used different avenues but are still reaching tens of millions of people each week by doing it. They've overcame that stigma that being a left-wing radio host is an impossibility. But it was... I had a chat with my boss, Chad Larson, who our station is independently owned, which is very, very, very rare in radio. Like, there's usually only a handful at most in any market in the country, but independently owned. We had a host retire, stop his show recently, Norman Goldman. So I was a bit concerned. I was like, what does that mean for the format overall? And Chad told me, he goes, actually, we're doing fantastic. Right now, this is the highest ratings we've ever had, and across the country, similar formatted stations are doing so well that they need more programming. So that was what inspired this idea for this talk, was after talking with him after Norman left the air, that I'm like, wow, this is actually thriving. But we see it beyond just radio, like with new media, with YouTube and podcasts. That one of my favorite podcasts, and Brad doesn't like this podcast at all, but is Chapo Trap House. And they are a leftist, socialist comedy podcast. But they are the #1 Patreon. And what Patreon is a way that people can subscribe for premium content of shows, like support content creators, and pay. Their model is $5 a month. And they make $100,000 a month just from people subscribing to the podcast for bonus content. So the left in new media, in podcasts, and now YouTube is growing fast, and it's the momentum's unstoppable with it, because for so long people were just starved of content like this because it wasn't allowed. But now that we have ways to access people, it's growing naturally. The last thing I want to talk about is with YouTube specifically, because the right wing was winning YouTube for a long time. And because right-wing talking points are very easy to edit into short little snippets and get their point across to people. So they would do things like SJW feminist loses their mind and spread their content that way. So it worried me for a while. It's like the right wing is really winning on YouTube. But what's been happening lately that really encourages me is that people like ContraPoints is a great example, but they make documentary-style videos that are extremely informative and that access young people. Like her specifically will take kind of like terms from memes or things that high school kids would say about issues like trans people or gay people. So some things where you could walk in some very vile content, but make it deliberately targeted to them in a documentary style where you come away going, oh, I guess I understand. The last thing to know, does anyone know what the Rubin Report is? You guys know what it is? So David Schultz talked about Trump, why he won was diagnosing those problems of the working class. And I agreed with that. And someone contacted Dave Rubin about me, saying that this guy doesn't call Trump a Nazi, he says the working class likes him. So I just got an email today from Dave Rubin's producer about potentially going on, and I'm like, oh yeah, I will take that opportunity in a second. So hopefully that pans out, but this is an awesome event. Thank you all for coming.